Tonight, we begin with a development that Western officials had feared, anticipated, and ultimately prepared for. A move by Moscow that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shattered decades of diplomatic assumptions. 72 hours that forced Berlin to abandon its carefully maintained caution. 72 hours that fundamentally rewrote Germany's security posture entirely. What the Kremlin did this week crossed a line that Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the German government had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Berlin did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with unprecedented scale, and with unmistakable resolve. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements from the foreign ministry, not public declarations through diplomatic channels, just signals that Russia was preparing something unprecedented in scope and ambition. Moscow has been aggressive throughout this conflict, yes, but they have been remarkably calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a predictable rhythm, almost a formulaic pattern that Western intelligence services had learned to anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Berlin, in Brussels, and across every NATO capital this week was that the familiar rhythm went completely silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military posture and Kremlin decision-making know the warning indicators all too well. The sudden redeployment of strategic assets to forward positions, the dramatic surge in encrypted communications between command centers, the quiet movement of senior command personnel away from Moscow, the sudden and complete cessation of back-channel diplomatic engagement, all of that went quiet simultaneously. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet in this particular way, it means something dramatic is about to get very loud indeed. Western intelligence services have seen this pattern before. It preceded the initial invasion. It preceded major offensive operations, and it has always preceded moments when Moscow believed escalation was necessary. Early Tuesday morning, German intelligence services, working in coordination with their American and British counterparts, detected what they described as an escalatory action of significant proportions, including the activation and deployment of military systems that had not been operationally deployed in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of strategic assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific to the international community: strategic deterrence messaging, operational theater escalation, or preparation for direct confrontation. NATO analysts across multiple agencies didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 categories at once. But what they did know with absolute certainty was that Russia was fundamentally changing its strategic posture in the theater. And when a nuclear-armed great power shifts its military posture without public explanation, even by what might appear to be a small measure, every Western capital pays immediate and intensive attention. The intelligence briefings that reached Chancellor Scholz's desk Tuesday morning reportedly described the situation as the most serious escalatory moment since the conflict began. The statement issued by Berlin tonight was not normal diplomatic communication. It was not routine bureaucratic process. It was not symbolic messaging designed for domestic audiences. It was urgent in a way German official communications rarely are. Official after official emerging from the Chancellery throughout the day described the Kremlin's move in remarkably stark terms, provocative in its timing and scope, destabilizing to the entire European security architecture, and perhaps most importantly, a direct and unmistakable violation of the implicit understandings that had prevented wider escalation throughout this conflict. But intimidation, which is clearly what Moscow intended, only works if the target hesitates. Germany did not hesitate for a single moment. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive, comprehensive, and militarily significant actions we've seen from any Western nation in the entire conflict. Here's what we know as of this hour. Within 48 hours of detecting the Russian action, Germany announced the largest military aid package in its entire post-war history. These weren't the gradual, carefully measured, politically cautious deliveries that Berlin had become almost infamous for. These were maximum capacity transfers, advanced weapon systems that Germany only releases from its own reserves when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation in Ukraine's favor. Tonight, the German Ministry of Defense confirmed that Berlin has launched an emergency military assistance program targeting Ukraine's most critical defensive needs, including additional Leopard 2 main battle tanks that had recently been held in strategic reserve for what analysts believe was lingering fear of Russian retaliation against German interests. Germany moved with extraordinary speed before Moscow could consolidate its new posture or develop counter-messaging. They committed additional Iris-T air defense systems capable of protecting entire cities from Russian missile barrages. They committed Gepard anti-aircraft platforms that have proven devastatingly effective against Russian drone swarms. They committed PZH-2000 self-propelled howitzers, along with massive ammunition supplies that were likely preparing to counter the anticipated Russian spring offensive. They committed Marder infantry fighting vehicles, bridging equipment, and millions of rounds of artillery ammunition. In other words, Germany targeted precisely the strategic capability gap in Ukraine's defensive posture that military analysts had been warning about for months. The exact capability shortfall that would have made a successful Russian breakthrough operationally possible. This is what made Berlin's statement so urgent and so remarkable. Russia's move wasn't just symbolic posturing for domestic audiences. While it was actionable military preparation, it represented the kind of concrete escalation that could reshape the entire conflict trajectory if left unchecked and unchallenged. And Germany, understanding that reality fully and completely, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, as some critics had feared during Germany's period of restraint, not impulsively, as a panicked reaction might appear, but strategically with clear operational objectives. They didn't send obsolete Cold War equipment from storage facilities. They didn't artificially limit quantities to avoid giving Moscow offense. They hit the exact capability gap that Ukraine needed, filled most urgently. They hit the weapon systems that would give Kyiv genuine battlefield parity with Russian forces. And here's where the story becomes even more strategically significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that the Kremlin's latest provocative move was specifically designed to test the genuine resolve of European unity after months of sustained economic pressure, rising energy costs, and visible political fatigue across the continent. Russia wanted to see whether Germany, long considered the weakest link in the Western alliance due to its energy dependence and pacifist traditions, would finally retreat into its historic caution when confronted with serious escalation. But instead, the exact opposite happened. Berlin didn't hesitate or convene endless deliberation committees. They issued a response that was so immediate, so comprehensive, and so militarily substantial that even the Kremlin's most confident strategists noticed immediately. You don't get the Kremlin's genuine attention easily. They dismiss most Western rhetoric as performative. But today, Germany got their complete attention. Defense analysts and former intelligence officials speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's shift as coercive signaling, a deliberate way to fracture Western consensus before the difficult winter months when energy pressures peak. But Germany proved today that they remain both deeply committed to Ukrainian sovereignty and operationally capable of backing that commitment with substance. Their military transfers were not only rapid in execution, they were coordinated so precisely with Ukrainian command structures that Ukrainian forces received detailed operational briefings before Russian intelligence could even fully assess the delivery scope and timeline. That kind of operational speed matters enormously because it shows something fundamental about Germany's transformation. It shows that Germany is not merely a reluctant participant in European security being dragged along by American pressure. They are now an active, willing, and capable defender of the European order they helped build. As reports continued coming in throughout the day from Berlin, Brussels, and Kyiv, we learned considerably more about the true scale of Germany's comprehensive response. The Bundeswehr carried out direct transfers from active-duty frontline units, forcing Germany to temporarily reduce its own substantial NATO rapid response commitments, a sacrifice Berlin had previously refused to make. German defense contractors received emergency orders targeting production lines that had been operating at partial capacity throughout the last 18 months due to political uncertainty about the conflict's duration. German military logistics units operating from staging areas in Poland reportedly established direct high-speed supply corridors that allow Ukraine to receive equipment faster than any previous transfer mechanism in the conflict. German intelligence services expanded their real-time sharing agreements with Ukrainian counterparts, providing targeting data and strategic assessments that had previously been withheld. This wasn't just military assistance in the traditional sense. This wasn't just diplomatic signaling designed for newspaper headlines. This was genuine strategic investment in Ukrainian victory. This was real operational commitment with concrete consequences. And operational commitment is the one thing Russia has consistently struggled to undermine since this conflict began. For every territorial advance Moscow has managed to achieve, the West has countered with something substantial that complicates their ability to consolidate gains and prepare for the next phase. Remember, Russia thought Germany would remain internally divided between economic interests and security commitments. They thought Berlin would ultimately prioritize cheap energy imports over abstract European solidarity. They thought deeply rooted German pacifism dating back to World War II would prevent any meaningful military support to an active conflict zone. They thought that when push came to shove, Germany would find reasons to stay on the sidelines. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening before the world's eyes. Germany is now leading European military assistance to Ukraine, surpassing even some of its more traditionally hawkish neighbors. Germany is actively sacrificing economic comfort and growth projections for collective security. Germany is demonstrating decisively that post-war military restraint has absolute limits when European peace is genuinely threatened. What makes this particular moment so critical and so potentially consequential for the conflict's trajectory is that Russia's latest escalatory move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary and multifaceted domestic pressure. Hardliners in the security services and military want more aggressive military action immediately. Political moderates with access to real information want some form of diplomatic resolution. Oligarchs watching their wealth evaporate want comprehensive sanctions relief. Military commanders in the field want adequate resources and trained reinforcements. Ordinary Russians increasingly want their sons and husbands to come home alive. Putin is attempting to balance all of these contradictory demands simultaneously while managing an economy under the most severe international sanctions pressure in modern history. And when leaders in that kind of constrained position make sudden dramatic moves, they're not doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're hoping that one bold action might change the strategic calculus in their favor. Germany's formal statement, now distributed across all NATO communication channels and released publicly in multiple languages, was designed to signal unambiguously that Berlin is not willing to allow Russian escalation to proceed unchallenged regardless of the risks involved. German officials said plainly that Russia's action was fundamentally inconsistent with the principles of European security, international law, and the norms that have maintained peace on this continent for generations. That is careful diplomatic language for a much simpler message. This is completely unacceptable, and we will respond with everything at our disposal. You don't usually hear that kind of unequivocal tone from Berlin unless something genuinely serious is at stake. Germany has spent decades building a reputation for careful, measured, consensus-seeking diplomacy. Today, they spoke with a different voice entirely. Meanwhile, Chancellor Olaf Scholz addressed the Bundestag in a direct, forceful, and remarkably personal speech tonight that observers are already calling historic. He said, "Germany will not be intimidated by threats designed to fracture our alliance and test our commitment to our values." He said, "Yet our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is not conditional on Russian behavior. It is unconditional and absolute." And he said, "History has taught Germany, perhaps more than any other nation, that the cost of inaction in the face of aggression always exceeds the cost of resolve." These are not rhetorical flourishes designed for domestic political consumption. These are definitive statements from a government that understands with perfect clarity just how high the stakes have become for European security and the international order. Here's what makes the current situation even more concerning for Western planners. Russia's latest provocative move wasn't an isolated action. Along with the primary military escalation that triggered Germany's response, Belarus also significantly increased troop concentrations near the Polish border, creating concerns about a potential northern front. Russian naval vessels conducted highly unusual maneuvers in the Baltic Sea near NATO member territorial waters. Coordinated cyber operations dramatically increased targeting critical infrastructure across Central Europe, including German systems. Russian diplomatic messaging became notably more aggressive across all channels simultaneously. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces on the strategic chessboard at once, it always means something larger is underway behind the scenes. Western analysts and intelligence officials are now actively considering several distinct possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing the groundwork for a major spring offensive that requires Western attention to be diverted and alliance unity to be fractured beforehand. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create artificial negotiating leverage before any potential diplomatic talks by demonstrating escalatory capability. A third possibility, the one that is worrying senior officials the most across Western capitals, is that Russia is systematically attempting to establish a new baseline of acceptable escalation, normalizing actions that would have been unthinkable just months ago. But today, Germany took that strategic card decisively off the table. They didn't offer merely symbolic condemnation through press releases. They didn't delay substantive response pending further consultations with nervous allies. They didn't limit their reaction to diplomatic channels and stern warnings. They responded with maximum available military force transferred directly to Ukrainian hands. What we're watching unfold now is a fundamental test of Western alliance cohesion. Russia wants to see whether sustained economic pressure and escalation anxiety will finally fracture Western unity. Germany wants to show definitively that European resolve is not for sale at any price. NATO as an institution wants to prevent any precedent of successful Russian intimidation tactics. And Ukraine wants to demonstrate to the world that it can withstand any Russian escalation as long as Western support remains firm. Tonight, we've heard from senior NATO officials who are now monitoring Russian force dispositions and command communications around the clock. They say Russia has not yet visibly responded to Germany's dramatic announcement. They say there are no current indications of further immediate escalation in the conflict theater, and they say the Kremlin's decision to cross established red lines is likely part of a broader calculated strategy intended to test Western resolve and limits before the difficult winter months ahead. But Germany is not retreating under pressure. In fact, Germany is doubling down on its commitment. Their response today, decisive, comprehensive, and completely unwavering, sent an unmistakable message to Moscow that intimidation tactics will not succeed against this alliance. And it sent an equally important message to the broader Western alliance that Germany is fully prepared to lead from the front when genuine leadership is required. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the Kremlin hoped to achieve with this dramatic escalation. But what we do know already is that Germany's response was extraordinarily timely. It reassured allies across Eastern Europe who had questioned Berlin's ultimate commitment. It strengthened Ukraine at an absolutely critical moment in the conflict's trajectory, and it demonstrated clearly that red lines cut both ways in international relations. What happens next will depend significantly on what Russia does in the next several weeks. If they retreat from their escalatory posture and return to previous patterns, this moment will be remembered as a decisive turning point in Western resolve. If they escalate further still, Germany and the broader NATO alliance have already demonstrated that they are fully prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in many months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely reassessing its assumptions. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet, and when Russia is quiet after a major action fails to achieve its intended effect, it means they are recalculating their entire approach. It means they are choosing their next move with unusual care. Because tonight, Moscow learned something they have learned many times before, but continue to forget at critical moments. Western unity is not a structural weakness to be exploited through pressure. Economic interdependence does not guarantee political compliance when security is threatened. And Germany, the very nation Russia most expected to fracture under pressure, is now leading the charge in European defense. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Germany has chosen its side without ambiguity. The West has demonstrated genuine resolve under pressure, and Russia's calculated gamble may have backfired more spectacularly than the Kremlin ever anticipated. And we will be here, watching every detail carefully as the next dramatic phase of this story unfolds.